Hi, so my name's Hal and welcome back to my channel. I'm here just to chat about all the books that I ended up reading in December. I actually ended up reading 9 books in December, which I think is partially because I spent a lot of time reading either collections of short stories or like short novellas kind of things. And you might be thinking, is this because I thought I wouldn't reach the kind of end of year, how many books I will read kind of goal? No, I reached that, I surpassed that. That's been going up since about kind of halfway through the year when I realised I was reading more than I thought I was going to. This was just because the holes of the library just kind of end up turning out that way, things that I was interested in picking up as well. So, 9 books this month, and I'm just going to kind of talk through them one by one. The first book that I read this month was the Bedlam Stacks by Natasha Pulley. This is an adult historical fantasy book that's set in the same world as The Watchmaker of Filigree Street and The Lost Future of Pepper Harrod by Natasha Pulley, which I have previously read. And with this one I have kind of read all of the Natasha Pulley books that are so far published, so that's something I definitely can discuss at some point. The setup for this is that we're following our main character, Merrick Tremaine, who has previously worked for kind of part of and a smuggler for the East India Company, now kind of the India office, and basically in his last kind of mission, really badly injures his leg and he's living at home with his brother who, they don't like each other very much. And basically now, in 1859, he's been asked to go on an expedition all the way to Peru, to the town of New Bedlam, to get cuttings of the chichona tree, from which you get quinine, because as you can imagine, it's the 1860s. Malaria. His family have had a previous personal connection to this town, and when he gets there he meets Raphael, who is a local kind of priest there, and he starts to learn more about kind of his own family's connection and about things that are going on in that town, because things, you know, aren't quite right. Something that I really appreciate with all of Natasha Pulley's books is that whilst there are definitely aspects to our writing which I obviously enjoy because I've read all of them, each book does feel quite different between them. I do think that obviously there are similarities between, you know, Watchmaker of Filigree Street and The Lost Future of Pepper Harrod being sequels. They are quite similar, but I would say that they're different from like The Half-Life of Valerie Kay or The Mars House and things like that. And this one again did feel very different. It's in first person, where the rest of her books have all been in third person. The first half of it is very much more of like an adventure story of him kind of getting to Peru with the people he gets there with. And I do think the second half becomes really kind of reflective in a way. The best way that I have to describe it is that there is a fanfiction which I've read several times where in the author's note, the author is like, I don't know why this is so weirdly like reflective, I don't know why this is so weirdly in like this character's head. And that's the same feeling that I had at the end of this book in a very real way. And like, yeah, I think it did have this bit of a slow start, but I really liked the direction that this book ended up going with. One of the things that I do really enjoy kind of throughout all of her books is this very real interest that Natasha Pulley has for language and how language changes over time. And that was really interesting, kind of interestingly done here. Some things that I've just not had thought about before, and kind of, I think especially between this book and between also my reading of the Temeraire series, I've been thinking about British colonialism like nothing else. But yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I do think it is very different, but I've still been thinking about some of the kind of ideas of it, even though I read it at the beginning of the month. And I ended up giving this, I think, 4 stars there. The next book that I ended up reading was The Wooded Midwinter by Susanna Clarke. This is a little kind of 60-page short story from Susanna Clarke. I've read other books, the other 2 books by her, so I've read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and I've read Piranesi, both of which I really liked, so I was interested in picking this up. This follows the story of Meredith, who is a young girl who is very much more interested in animals and being in the woods than with kind of people. And she goes into the woods with her dogs on a day in midwinter, and kind of there's a little story that appears from there. I really like Susanna Clarke's writing, however I do feel like basically I read the story and I was like, I like the writing, but I'm not really getting what we're trying to do here. And then I read the author's note at the end of the book where she mentioned that this is almost like a little story that was meant to be in one of the footnotes for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and is kind of set in that world, at which point I went, oh yeah, this does actually make sense. I get what she was going with there, and I did think it made more sense at that point, but I do think that there is a limitation with something being so short, so I found myself a little bit wanting, but you know, that's kind of the case. The next book that I finished was Black Powder War by Noami Novik. This is the third book in the Temeraire series, and which is kind of an adult fantasy series which follows kind of alternate history. What would happen if during the Napoleonic Wars, Captain William Lawrence ended up stealing almost the dragon that was meant to go to Napoleon instead, and going kind of, how does the war shake out kind of thing. At this point in the book, obviously in the previous book we were in China doing various diplomatic things. We are now leaving China and then getting involved with some political dealings with the Ottoman Empire, and then there's more fighting kind of in Europe. This book was really fun, and there's definitely parts of it that I enjoyed. There's definitely scenes that stuck out to me and emotional beats that really stuck with me. However, from no fault of the book, I was just having a hard time listening to it. I just kept zoning out and missing huge chunks. So I don't feel like I got the full experience of the book. What I did, I really enjoyed. I did enjoy that we're getting back to some of those action scenes, which are really fun to kind of read. I'm enjoying that we're getting a bit more of kind of politics and discussion about kind of the way that the world is set up, especially in kind of England and the British Empire, regarding how dragons are treated and things like that, without also, greater discussion about colonial England, I guess, in that regard. But yeah, the whole zoning out thing, not great, but it's also not an issue with the book. It's an issue that I sometimes have when I'm listening to audiobooks whilst also doing other tasks, which is on me. But I will just say that it wasn't, I guess, the only downside is sometimes it wasn't as engaging as the other two books, but I am still interested in following this series. I'm just fighting to the death with my library about getting the next audiobook. So I did end up giving this book 3 stars as well. The next book that I did end up finishing was The Valley of Fear by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Like I have with the other Sherlock Holmes novels this year, I did read this via Letters from Watson over the past kind of 2 months. There's basically 2 parts of the story. The first part is the investigation of the actual kind of murder mystery, which happens in this like big fancy house that kind of looks like a castle with a moat and everything, and I wouldn't say it's a locked room mystery because there's definitely someone has escaped out of a window, but you do have a similar kind of setup where a dead body has been found in a room. It was a very short period of time between a murder occurring and people turning up, so like what's actually happened there. And that part's, always really fun. And then the second half of this novel is a look back into the past and how, the people who are involved in this got to the point that they are now, and it becomes a bit of a mystery, a little bit of a kind of a spy situation, I would say, which was also, I think, done really well in comparison to something like A Study in Scarlet, where the same kind of idea is done, but we're traveling across the middle of America is just like really boring in that one, whereas I felt like this was a lot more interesting as a side tangent into a period of American history, as Conan Doyle was interested in doing at the time, and then it did all tie back together in a good way as well. So overall I did give this 3 stars as well. The next book that I read was The Winter Spirits, Ghostly Tales for Frosty Nights, which is a collection of short stories that are all based around kind of ghost stories set in the winter or kind of around Christmas by a bunch of different authors. Yes, the reason that I do know about this short story collection is because Natasha Pulley has a short story in this, but like that's actually not the one I think that I end up enjoying the most. So I really liked all of these. I felt like they all worked within the theme and the idea of the collection. I would say that probably like 90% of these stories I really enjoyed. They like gave me the spooks as I was reading them. There was a part of this, of every story where I was tense and I was worried about what was happening. And I feel like they did that really, really well. However, there was one story that I didn't like. I thought that I could understand what the author was trying to do with that story and doing with those characters, and it was an interesting kind of look at something that really happened in history. I just did not like any of the characters in it, so it did not work for me. And then there was another story as well, which, like, again, I could see where the story was going and what it was trying to do. It just did not work for me in the same way that all the other stories. I think if some of the other stories hadn't been, like, so good and actually made me kind of feel dread and worry, then the fact that this one was, like, just okay and wasn't doing that would have been, you know, understandable. But because so much of this book was kind of, like, really got to me, the ones that didn't work as well did stand out a lot more, I would say. If you want to read a collection of short, spooky ghost stories that are set in winter, I would recommend this, is what I would say. I think it's difficult to obviously rate a collection of short stories, but I would say I definitely liked it. I think I've ended up giving it, like, a 3-star rating. The next book that I read was a short novella. It's When Among Crows by Veronica Roth, which is a kind of urban fantasy novella set in Chicago, where our main character, Demeter, is on a quest to find Baba Yaga and makes various friends and acquaintances with various supernatural creatures within the city in his quest to kind of get there and stuff like that. It's set up to be occurring over kind of like 3 days or something like that. I felt like this was very strong in some places, and it really worked for what it was trying to do. It's got a lot of fun kind of references to Polish culture and Polish folklore, obviously with the Baba Yaga being included in that. I felt like a lot of those things were discussed in a modern context really interestingly. The body horror that turns up with this absolutely slapped. It's not meant to be, like, it's not primarily a horror or anything like that, but I felt like the elements that were done were really good, and it's something that, again, this little story has stuck with me in a way that some of the other stories that I read this month haven't really. I do keep on thinking about it. But yeah, I think it does a really good job at kind of what it's doing. It is just a little short story, which, again, I think I struggle with rating them, but it's one that I enjoyed quite a bit. So this one's kind of on that, I think I rated it 3 stars, but it's kind of that 3-4 kind of line, so I did really enjoy this one. The next book that I finished was What Moves the Dead by Kingfisher. This is a little horror novella following kind of an adaptation of the story of the fall of the House of Usher, where we follow our main character, Alice Easton, who's kind of an ex-soldier who has been called to the Usher house because they were friends with both of the Usher siblings, and kind of things unfold from there, very much in the vein of the main story there, because, you know, the sister is dying. What's going on? It's very much an exploration of the fall of the House of Usher. T. Kingfisher herself, in the kind of author's notes, describes that she wanted to kind of look into why is what's happening in the House of Usher happening, and kind of what's the explanation for it, and does that via the vein of kind of mushroom and fungal horror. I do think that this does what it sets out to do well. I did enjoy all of the weird, gross science stuff and all the weird, gross mushroom stuff. There's like a dissection scene in this. Great. I love that shit. However, I don't think this was necessary. I read The Fall of the House of Usher earlier on this year, and I thought it was great, and I thought that that story is doing what it needs to do, and we don't need to have an exploration of why is this happening, if that makes sense. Part of the reason that I actually picked this book up, apart from obviously hearing people really like T. Kingfisher's work and being interested in the concept, is that one of my friends actually tried to pick this up as an audiobook and really struggled with some parts of it. So that's both the character of Agnes, who talks with like a Scottish brogue. He was listening to the audiobook where, you know, they were obviously doing that. I was reading an ebook version of it, and which I think was better. But we're still, you know, we're not that far off of writing a dialect phonetically, is what I would say, at some points. The other issue that I think he had was, like, at some points there's various asides where we're talking a bit more about the lore of the world. Alex comes from kind of a made-up little European country where the author kind of uses that to play a bit with the idea of pronouns. Basically, people in this country have a certain set of pronouns that they use as kind of children before, choosing a different set of pronouns as they grow older, and there's also similarly a set of pronouns they would use if you went into military service. People then can go back to other pronouns after military service, or they can remain with those pronouns after the military service, which is kind of what Alex does, which is why I've been referring to them with they them pronouns, although they obviously use that specific set in the book. I really enjoy little asides, I enjoy little footnotes, I think it's really interesting. I think that some parts of that were also kind of done quite well. We have various characters who interact with Alex in this book, and there's various levels of people who already know what their deal is, people who, meet them and know enough about this country and this kind of thing that they do to be able to refer to them correctly, and people who meet them and are like, I don't know what you're doing, which I do think is very accurate to the experience of being someone with an ambiguous gender presentation. But, I don't think it's something that's going to work for everyone if you're not someone who enjoys little asides or little footnotes to kind of do that kind of thing for it. So, obviously I have a lot of thoughts about it. I do think that for what it was doing, it was good at what it was doing. I don't know if it was necessarily required, but I did have a fun time reading it. I ended up giving it 3 stars. I am interested in picking up the next book in this series as well. The next book that I ended up reading was the Tales from Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. This was mainly because I needed an audiobook to fill in the time as I was trying to wait for the next Temeraire audiobook, which did not happen. So I've not actually read any of the other Earthsea books, which is something that Miss Ursula K. Le Guin in the introduction explicitly says you should listen to this after, reading the other Earthsea books. So I do think that I came into this on the wrong foot, and so it was a little bit more difficult for me to get, understand this world, get invested in kind of what was going on with the stories. But basically the idea of this is various stories that have happened in the history of Earthsea that Ursula K. Le Guin had to consider and had to kind of write about so that she could go from the previous books in the Earthsea kind of series to the next full novel that she was writing. And I think for kind of what they do that really well. I definitely found that the stories that came kind of after about maybe the 1/3 midpoint, I really enjoyed those a lot more than kind of the first story, and I definitely appreciated kind of what she was trying to do there. I also think that the introduction, where she's talking about, again, the commodification of fantasy and the loss of kind of how new characters can just become stereotypes and people just kind of reuse interesting plots and things like that, absolutely, slapped. I love hearing her talk about things that she's, knowledgeable and interested in. I've read other books by her. I read The Left Hand of Darkness, and I've read something else which I can't remember the name off the top of my head. And she does what she's, whatever she puts her mind to, I feel like she does really well. And this is probably another example of it, but it just didn't work as well for me because I went into it without knowing a huge amount about the story that this is actually set in, which is absolutely on me, but I just struggled with it a little bit. I don't think the narrator as well was doing the best job of keeping me engaged, to be quite honest. But I did end up giving this 3 stars. So the last book that I read this month was The Hunchback of Notre-Dame by Victor Hugo. This is one of the other kind of classics that Victor Hugo has written, and in this book we are following various characters, and it all centers around kind of 1, the Notre Dame, and 2, a young Romani girl called Lasmeralda, and then we're also following Claude Frollo, his younger brother Jehan Frollo, Quasimodo, the titular Hunchback of Notre-Dame, Pierre Gringoire. Don't worry about him. Oh, and Phoebus and things like that. What I would say is that I'm glad that this was the second Victor Hugo book that I wrote, because I feel like there's a lot of things that he's doing in this book that he similarly does in Les Mis, and he does them better in Les Mis. This book it starts with a rambling introduction about the history of Notre Dame and Paris as a city, except that he does not preface this as this is an introduction to the history and the, you know, architecture and things like that. You just start, and then you just have to read it and go, well, I hope at some point he's going to introduce characters, which he does. It's an experience is what I would say. So obviously having read Les Mis and knowing that he enjoys going on digressions which are, you know, maybe not essential to the plot, but are really interesting looks into history, his own personal opinions about stuff, and obviously that reflects what were the political and otherwise general public opinions about X at the time. So I don't think that it's, you know, boring or not useful as part of the book, but it definitely is an experience to open a book and be faced with the whole first, like, book in it to just be a rambling explanation about the history of Paris and the architecture of Notre-Dame. I think that this was good. I don't know, it's really hard to discuss kind of classic things of literature because obviously Hunchback of Notre-Dame has had such a massive effect on kind of the world and pop culture and things like that. In the introduction to this book, it explains how this book actually revitalized a lot of public interest in Notre Dame and led to it being, you know, attempts at preservation and restoration being made that meant that we still have the Notre Dame kind of today. It's obviously been adapted, you know, in various ways. Obviously, one of the most famous recent ones was the Disney animated movie, and then also a stage musical adapted off that kind of same idea. But yeah, I went into this having seen a bootleg of the stage musical, but never having seen the Disney movie, so it was definitely an experience to kind of read this for the first time and, like, learn the source material. I think that a lot of the things in it are done well. I think it's a fun story. I definitely had, you know, a fun time talking about it to my friends who were kept captive while I was going, like, oh my god. I do think that there are parts of this story which are kind of more difficult to read, especially as a modern reader. Obviously, there is a story that portrays, like, Jewish and Romani people in quite a negative light, and this is not, I would say it's part of the plot. It is very much something that other characters in the world think, but I wouldn't say that Victor Hugo does a good job of kind of dismissing that story as not true or anything like that. There's still kind of, I do think the portrayal of the Romani people in this book is definitely complicated in a lot of ways. And similarly, the portrayal of kind of Quasimodo with his disabilities is also, I would say, quite complicated. But I do think it's also interesting to kind of learn, you know, see that in a book written at this time and kind of seeing how that reflects on things that are still stereotypes that kind of get brought around, and how, you know, what ways have we changed, what ways haven't we changed. It's not as straightforward as just being like a fun little adventure romp. There's a bit more meat on those bones. But I do think overall I did like it. I did obviously go into this both already knowing that I do enjoy works by Victor Hugo, and that I had recently been to Paris and seen the Notre Dame and had big feelings about all of that, so I think that did help. And yeah, I don't know if that made any sense, but those are my feelings. That is everything that I read this past month in December. I have actually already, because I'm filming this in the new year, I have actually already finished a couple of books so far. But it's looking like I might be reading a couple more little short stories in the beginning of the month, and then hopefully settling into some other books as well this year. I am planning to make a video talking about kind of all the books that I read in 2024 and things that I'm looking forward to in 2025 in a couple of weeks' time. So that should be interesting and everyone wants to hear about me talk about that. But overall, thank you for watching. I hope that you're having a nice day, and I hope that you've been reading some nice books as well. Bye! Also, if you heard scrabbling and someone coming up under the counter before, that's Pumpkin, who is the little cat I live with. So I tend to lock her out of my room, but you were very hungry today, so I had to let you have your breakfast.